Products on plain backgrounds can be tricky, but I think if carefully done, you can still get great results that hopefully don't have to look boring. So with that said, let's start with setup number 1. I put the can on a plain background and framed it as a macro shot to capture the details of the can itself. I started with an HDRI to set my ambient light exposure, and I used one called Art Studio from Polyhaven. Now this is important. Depending on which HDRI you use, you need to pay attention to the reflections that HDRI is casting on your subject, especially if your subject is reflective like mine is. So I went to the coordinates tab of the HDR and played with the rotation heading until the reflection highlights is right here where I wanted them to be. Then I increased the exposure to 0.65 and called it good. Next, I added the key light and added a null as a target to make adjusting the direction of the light easier to control. I set the exposure to -4.5, kept the size of the light as default, and reduced the spread to 0.1. So with plain backgrounds, I typically don't pay any attention to how the light is hitting the background until the key light is set at least. And now that it's set, the next issue was to fix this dark spot on the background that I didn't like. So I added another area light that's exactly the same size as the key light and pointed it towards the background like so. I also made sure this light does not affect any other object in the scene except for the background by going into the project settings, setting the mode to include, and dragging the background object into this field. Now, this last step wasn't that necessary, but I noticed the bottom left area of the frame was a bit bright because the key light was reflecting rather strong off of the backdrop. So to dim that down, I added a plain object as a blocker to block some of that light being reflected off of the ground. And if you look at this comparison, you can see that it made a slight difference in the exposure, which I think helps draw more attention to this part of the can, which is where I want the viewer's eyes to gravitate toward anyway. All right, so here's the result for setup number 1. Let's move on to setup 2. All right, so for this, we're only going to use area lights to light the can, so this time there's no help from an HDRI. I first started with the key light. I placed it as a side light and slightly above so that it's aiming downward toward the can. And honestly, that looks kind of great as is. It's perfect for a quote-unquote one light setup, which seems to be quite popular. But there are a few problems that I notice. One, the background looks a little too dull for me. I'd want it to be much brighter in this case since the can already has a low color value. A brighter background will create more contrast and an overall interesting image, in my opinion. And 2, the shadows on the right side here are way too dark, so we need to lift those up. So for the background, I added an area light, which significantly brightens up the background, and hey, even some of the shadows on the right side look a little bit lifted as well. Nice. And for a bit more depth, I added a subtle rim light on the right side of the frame. Doing this, we get a nice highlight up here in the can's rim, as well as along the body of the can, which I think improves the image a bit more. Now, are we done? Maybe. We can be. But I think we can improve this image just a little bit more by darkening this portion of the can. Since we added so much light already, this part of the can seems a bit too bright, in my opinion, which can be in danger of flattening out the entire image. So, to subtract the light from here, I added one bended plane with a black texture to surround the right side of the can. Now, to show you exactly what that did, here's a comparison. See, notice how adding that negative fill card just reduced the exposure of that shadow part just a little bit more. Now, we're still getting a bit of reflection light from the bottom of the backdrop, so I added another plane with a black texture on it and placed it right here to prevent some of that reflected light from hitting the can. And to show you what that did, here's a comparison of that. Great, I think this looks great. For this last setup, it's not exactly a plain background like the previous 2 examples, but the singular color theme can suggest it falls under the category of plain. So I started with an HDRI to set the ambient light exposure and used Art Studio again from Polyhaven. I set the exposure to -0.75 and decreased the saturation to 0 so that none of the color information from the HDR influenced the scene. I went into the coordinates tab and rotated the HDR so that this highlight in particular lands on this part of the can. However, I don't want this highlight to end up in the final shot. So I added a plane object to camera right and bended it with a bendiformer to block that light source coming from the HDRI. So when doing this, we now have a clean, flat ambient light exposure. And then I added the key light. I decreased the exposure about 3.5 stops and added one of GSG's softbox fabric light maps, which helped concentrate the light's hotspot towards the center of the area light as opposed to a uniform light source. Now, there may not be a significant difference on the can itself, but one main thing this helped is taking off some light off of the background, which does help in maintaining control of the different exposures of the scene. Then I added a rim light to the can by adding an area light right behind the can like so. I set the size of it to about 1:2, but the way it's angled I don't think makes much of a difference. Alright, so obviously it's way too bright, right? So I decreased the exposure of it to -7.5, and it may look a little too low right now, but I ended up decreasing the spread as well to about 0.112. And once I did that, I got this nice sharp highlight near the bottom of the can, which for the composition of the frame ended up looking really nice to me, in addition to this nice fall-off rim light from the bottom up we get on this can. Alright, and for the background, I added another area light that pointed directly at the background itself at about the same angle as the key light. I then decreased the exposure to about -4.5 EVs and added one of GSG's tree loop gobo textures in the texture slot. And of course, to make the gobo work in Redshift, I set the spread down to 0. And to make sure that this light affected only the platform in the background and not the can, in the project settings, I placed the background and platform object in the object field and set the mode to include. From here, it's just a matter of playing with the size, the position, and the rotation of the light to aim those shadows where you want it in the frame. So this image is almost done. One thing that bothered me was the droplets. I didn't feel as if the specular reflections were standing out as much as I'd like to. So what I ended up doing was adding another area light, and I called it Droplet Reflections, dragged all of the droplet objects in the Objects field of the Project tab, and set the mode to include. What this does is it makes it so that only the droplets are the only objects affected by this light. And then I decreased the exposure of this light to about -4, added a GSG softbox fabric texture in the texture slot for the reflections, and decreased the spread to about 0.6. And then from there, I just messed around with the position of that light to get the specular reflections that I want for the droplets. Now to show you what difference that made, here's the comparison between one without the droplet reflection light versus the one with. Notice how the droplets have a little bit of a catch light to them as opposed to the one without that added light. And in my opinion, this helps make the image pop just a little bit more. Alright, so here are the 3 lighting setup results I created for this week. I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for watching and hope to see you next time. Take care.